Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Code with B. In this video, we will learn about GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language that is defined for the APIs. It allows to create queries on the server and then client can run those queries. GraphQL server will execute the queries and returns the result. GraphQL server has a schema-based type system. All the fields defined in the type system can be accessed by the client in the form of query or the mutation. When we are talking about APIs, the first thing that comes to mind is REST. This is the existing and well-proven standard for exposing the APIs that is there for so long. So why do we need to learn a new tool such as GraphQL? For that, we will look at some of the examples of the REST APIs and will see the underlying problems that can be fixed by GraphQL. Suppose there is an API that returns a list of users. Every user can contain personal details, address, and the orders. Now, assume there is a page where you want to show all the users with their personal details. This API can work. If orders has to be shown in some page for all the users, this API can be used. In both of these examples, though this API can work, but when we are using these APIs, every time whenever we are calling the API, it is returning more data than needed. In general, it doesn't look like a big problem. But if we have a larger set of data, then there could be multiple problems. Number one, if server is returning more data, then for this extra data, more network bandwidth is required. Secondly, on the client side, it would take more space. And if we are talking about the devices such as mobile, where memory could be one of the issue, then it could lead to more problems. To resolve these problems, one of the solution could be to divide APIs into multiple APIs so that specific API returns a specific area of the domain. Now, if we look at the APIs, API/users return only minimal information of the user. Personal Details API return personal details of all users. Address API returns addresses of the users, and similarly, Orders API returns orders of the user. Now, for the dashboard where we are displaying the Personal Details API can be used. Similarly, for the Orders API can be used. Now, there could be one of the scenario where client needs personal detail and address to be displayed in a single page. Then either he has to call two APIs or one more API has to be created on server which returns personal detail and address. So you are never sure what is less or what is more. You have to be ready for the client changes all the time. While making any changes, you have to be sure that the existing contract doesn't break. Now, to understand how the other system handle these kind of scenarios, we will divert our discussion to the database. Now assume there is a table user and client want to fetch all the records. For doing that, a query can be called which returns all the users like select star from user. If name and email is required, then the query can be called for select name, email from user. It will only return name and email of all the users. If data has to be fetched from multiple tables, then a query can be created to join multiple tables and then database will return the combined result of multiple tables. Doing all this, database uses a structured query language and client can call this SQL based on its requirement, and database is going to return only the amount of data which is requested by the client. No more, no less. If same kind of behavior can be achieved on the API level, the problem which we discussed earlier can be solved quite easily. Thankfully, GraphQL does the same. As I stated earlier, GraphQL has a type-based system where query can be defined on the server and then client can call the query to get the required result. So suppose there is a list of product and user want to fetch ID, name, brand and category of the products. So client can query for all these fields and GraphQL server will return the result. If client is interested in only ID and name of the product, same query can be applied and GraphQL server will return the ID and name of all the products. If a particular product has to be fetched from the server, so based on the specific field like ID, the query can be created and server will respond with the result. If resource has to be created or updated on the server, then mutation can be used and client can provide the input based on the required fields or the objects and server will create or update the resource. The API can be written in flexible way so that all the parameter of a particular product or a specific field can be provided to create or update the resource. For doing all these queries and mutation, GraphQL uses a single endpoint which is /GraphQL or any endpoint which can be configured on the server. It keeps client away from all the hassles to remember the different endpoints. Client can decide on what data to be fetched from the server by defining the fields on the query and server will return only that amount of data. So client has a clear control on the data to be retrieved. For doing any changes on the API, new fields can be added to the types and client can still use the query the way they were using earlier irrespective of changes on the server. Modification and addition on the queries is quite easy. You need not to worry about the clients. If client has to use the new contract that is well exposed using the documentation of the GraphQL, client can always go through the documentation and can see what has changed on the server and they can start implementing the new changes. So this is about GraphQL. In the next video, we will learn how to create GraphQL server in Node.js and how to use the queries. Till then, happy coding!